So we are honored today. My name is Rick Davis, and I'm the president of this group. So I get to welcome you all here. Thank you all for coming. And we are honored today to have a speaker who has a lot of interesting information to tell us that we probably don't know very much about a town not so far from here. So with that, I'll let Amanda Shelmerdine take over.
Great. Thank you very much, Rick. I've got the little speaker, so I should do okay. Well, thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Amanda Shelmerdine, and I am the cemetery sexton for the town of Warren. I have 18 cemeteries in which I take care of, maintain, help with burials, etc. And Peterborough is just one of them. So bear with me while I get used to the clicker and everything else for the presentation. Also, a little bit about me. I've been the sexton for 18 months with the town of Warren. I was the assistant sexton for 2 years before. And in regards to genealogy, I am an adoptee. And in 1995, using the International Soundex Reunion Agency, which back then it really wasn't internet, it was mail in, send for the form, mail it in, wait. I was reunited and met my birth mother. And through the modern type of technology for adoptee reunification, through 23andMe and ancestry.com, she was able to find out who her mother was as well, who has since passed. So, because she was adopted as well. So research has always been kind of important, and finding out who we are, where we've come from. But an important thing is, as we age, for me, it's also keeping a record of what went on in the past, because sometimes stories that are told don't always get kept. And the community of Peterborough is one of them. And at this time, the cemetery of Peterborough is the last remaining remnant of what used to be a very vibrant community within the town of Warren. So Peterborough Cemetery, this is a photo taken last summer of the old sign that we had there. It's located off of Bunker Hill Road, and it's about 1.3 miles from the intersection of Route 1 and Sandy Shores Drive. The graveyard is accessible by walk-in only. There is very limited parking there, so if you decide to visit, more than welcome to, but you'll need to park by the sign and just be aware of any of our neighbors that on either side that their driveways are not blocked. Some little information about the cemetery. First of all, the cemetery was part of an original 150 acres of land given to Amos Peters by General Henry Knox, and was settled in the early 1780s by Amos Peters and his wife, Sarah. Sarah was brought to Warren by a sea captain who brought her as the first slave that came to Warren. And with about a year after her indenture with him, she found out that slaves were had been emancipated in Massachusetts, of which we were still part of at that time. And so she had paid a local lawyer $1 to help gain her freedom. So she and Amos coincidentally settled just down the road from where Captain McIntyre's household was. And Henry Knox had the land originally because he had kind of gotten it through his marriage through Lucy Fluker, and that was part of the Waldo patent. The oldest headstone in the cemetery is that of Sarah E. Peters, daughter of William H. and Sarah Peters, and she died March 13th, 1855 at age 8. Now, even though that is the oldest stone that is there, the cemetery also has quite a few unmarked graves and graves that only have a simple field stone as a memorial marker. There are 36 headstones within the cemetery now. Some of them are doubles. The newest headstone, which is a cenotaph, is of Paul W. Shepard, known by his family as Pee Wee. He was the son of Cynthia E. Peters, who was married to Sidney C. Peters, one of our veterans, and he died October 16th, 2022. And again, there's also numerous fieldstone markers for the graves. There is one unmarked but known burial location, and that is of Sidney's brother, and that is Frederick Peters, who was buried at the beginning of the B row. Now, with this cemetery, the resources that I have had as sexton has been varied, and we'll learn a little bit more about that. But the numbering of these rows, as with the remainder of our cemeteries, was done in 1985 by a Mr. Overlock, who put out the Cemeteries of Warren book, which has become my absolute Bible. And in it, he did number the graves. Not all of those, number the rows and the graves. Not all of those matched up, because it kind of went like this. But if you've got a good imagination, we did find it, because that one I was told about prior to our ceremony last October. I met up with Sydney's daughter, who is also named Sydney. And she told me that her uncle was buried next to her father, but that temporary marker was gone. And so I was able to take a metal detector that I have and be able to find the outline of his casket. So the family now knows with certainty, of course, that he is there, and they are welcome to put up a stone should they wish to in the future. Also during my research, I have found 19 documented burials, but no lot number or headstone that was noted on their records. So I have a list of 19 more people that were interned there, but we don't have any headstones for them. The oral history is upwards of 100 unmarked graves, which includes underneath these beautiful big eastern white pines, which are located west of the cemetery, in between Bunker Hill Road and the cemetery gates. I have gone there early morning when there's been a heavy dew on the ground and counted the depressions that I've been able to see, and I've counted about 60. And that's not underneath the trees, because at this point, we've been removing a lot of the old brush and duff that's underneath the trees. But the ones in the graveyard that's been fenced in itself, I've counted about 60. This cemetery has also been known by the names of Peterborough Yard, Peters Cemetery, and also, while historically noted, but not appropriate by today's standard, it's also been known and in written documentation, legal documentation, as Darkytown Cemetery and Niggertown Cemetery. The road that used to run from top to bottom was called Niggertown Road. That name was thankfully taken away and is now known on the upper half as Nilo Hill Road, then Lindsay, and then Stark Road. Any future internments within this cemetery will be restricted to Peters family descendants only. So, in regards to Peterborough Cemetery and our Veterans Monument, this is where a wonderful man by the name of John Mine comes into play. So John himself was a 20-year veteran with the U.S. Air Force, and very active when he lived here in Maine with his local VFW. I was first approached by John in mid-2020 if he could do some things within the cemetery. He had read an article in the Working Waterfront about the Peterborough community. And he was very, very touched by it and a little bit angry. It really wanted him to make a difference, not only for the veterans' graves that were there, but because this was the only thing that was remaining in a community that held upwards of 300 people at its peak. He felt that the veterans were not recognized enough, and the community as a whole was not given the same recognition as their whiter counterparts. So with approval from a prior sexton before me, he had already gone ahead and started to make some changes within the cemetery. During COVID, he had several of the veterans' paver or flat monument headstones reseeded, because through time, that's a very sandy area, and they tend to settle differently. So he had one of our monument companies, Brooks Monuments, come in and reseat those. He also purchased specific theater of war flag holders for the veterans in there, because while those were available back then for families, the town of Warren just has a generic veteran marker at this time. And so he wanted to make sure that those that were in World War I, World War II, Korean War, such as for Sydney Peters, were recognized by those specific theater of war flag holders. After John got done, getting those things done, he wanted to do more. And in his walks of our cemetery, he noticed that we had 3 unmarked graves that were both up at the front and the lower right-hand side of our cemetery. And on these three graves, there was a combination of Civil War and post-144 flag holders. Post-144, of course, was the veterans group that was started. It was the William Payson Post that was started after the Civil War, that were sitting on these unmarked graves. And John wanted to have these graves identified and purchase or arrange through the military to have military stones placed on these graves to honor those veterans. Well, part of the problem with this wonderful idea is that the town of Warren did not have a lot of information in regards to Peterborough Cemetery, and in particular those unmarked graves. For anybody that works in a cemetery or has family in cemeteries, sometimes you know that things walk and move. When it comes to veterans markers and the flag holders for cemeteries, we have had mowers sometimes that have knocked them over, and once they realize, they get up and put them back in the ground, but they may not have been put back in the right spot. Or I remember being in one of the cemeteries last year doing some work, and I had a mother come up to me with a marker, a flag marker, and she said that her child had picked it up. Didn't know which one it belonged to, but here you go. So luckily I did know where it went. But unfortunately, with Peterborough, as with many of our other ancient burial ground cemeteries, we don't have burial maps. And so it was very hard, with the lack of oral history from people who knew who was buried or might have been buried in those graves, and the lack of documentation to really know for sure who might be there. Now, we do know within the cemetery that there is one known veteran, Daniel Lineo, that I do have the death card for, that he was buried there, was from one of our local funeral homes. But again, I don't know exactly where he's buried. I've got a very good idea, which is one of those spots that was marked, but not knowing for sure, you don't want to put a marker on someone's grave without documentation. So because there was no way to absolutely identify these three unmarked graves, another proposal was offered to John. It was a monument to honor all veterans who either settled, moved to, or were born in the Peterborough community. This was to make sure that everyone was recognized, remembered, and honored. I would do the research and identify these veterans. John would provide the funding as our benefactor, and we were a great team. The goal was to have the research completed and monuments set in the cemetery for a ceremony prior to John and Karen mine moving to California in the fall of 2023. So here's the challenge. What do you do now? Where to next? So with this, I thought I would start with the town of Warren, with where to begin. So the documentation that I had for this particular cemetery was very, very minimal. The list of veterans that the town of Warren provided me as sexton at that time was not accurate. And this was due to veteran flag holders being moved and somebody, a prior sexton perhaps, just walking through the cemetery and writing down the names that were next to those flag holders. And many of those were not in any of the wars. And the recording of information was done of the current location of the markers only, and only of the military headstones. So there wasn't any background or family information that was in our files that would give us this information. Because this is one of our historical cemeteries, which qualifies as one of Maine's ancient burial grounds, that means that the cemetery was in use before 1880. We didn't have any burial maps, and there wasn't any historical documentation that I could find at that time at the town office. So my research on the veterans and the community members of Peterborough really helped identify all but one headstone marker within the cemetery itself. And I'm still trying to figure out how that individual, there's only initials, who it was. But during my time doing all of this research for the veterans, I was able to verify, again, these 19 additional confirmed buried family members, as well as we had 2 partial headstones that were in there that I was able to, through documentation and research done by Rick Davis here, figure out who those people were and to be able to give them a proper name, not just the partial information that was on their stone. Moving on from the town of Warren, my next stop was to check with our historical society. And I realize you can't see this very well. This certainly was more information than the town of Warren had on file. And while this was wonderful, it still was incomplete, and some of it wasn't accurate because, again, it's the oral history, it's people writing things down. And unfortunately, what I have found is that the documentation that was turned over to the Historical Society, or things that were gathered for Peterborough, the school of Peterborough, and the cemetery itself, were very scant compared to the other parts of town for our town's history. So this was a good start, but then I had to go through some more names. And, also in doing this, I was trying to look up other Peters families' descendants, because we had who we knew was buried in the cemetery, but we also wanted to go by who we knew wasn't. So at the top of this, it lists the Revolutionary War veterans, and there are 2 veterans that are listed here. There is Amos Peters, who was the founder with his wife, Sarah, of the Peterborough community. And there was also a Paul Mink that was put under there. However, Paul Mink was not a Revolutionary War veteran from Warren. There was one in Maine from Waldoboro. But Sarah had a child by a white German immigrant by the name of Paul Mink prior to her marrying Amos, and she named her son Paul Mink. So the inclusion of Paul Mink right here wasn't accurate. So Paul Mink actually was Amos's stepson. And then there's other information on the different veterans that we knew that were buried there because they had headstones. So the other resources that I did use while trying to look up was the genealogy table for the Civil War veterans and the sons of veterans that our Historical Society had compiled, which was very helpful. The World War II list of veterans, they also have a World War I as well. Our Warren Civil War monument, which was helpful, but it didn't have all the names on it that I was coming across. Our post-144 records, which was Daniel Linneo, Abram Peters, and William H. Peters. And some of the oral history from family descendants, both in Midcoast and out of state, and Warren community members. I mentioned this book before. This was the picture right here. But books and publications and the internet, really, because there wasn't a lot of local documentation, was the way that I really gleaned my information. As you know, looking up genealogy, when you're researching anything, there really is no one true way to start doing something. And sometimes it's literally a shot in the dark. So trying to broaden my scope, I did utilize the Annals of Warren. It's a book that was written for the dates between 1605 and 1876 by Cyrus Eaton, who was one of our town clerks and town historians. I also was privy, because of my role as sexton, of being able to see some amazing documents to put my hands on them that had been preserved by the town of Warren, which included the record of births, marriages, and deaths. In the first edition, it's this document that's been preserved. And again, it's being able to put your hands on something that was back in the 1700s is just quite remarkable. I also relied on Maine's Visible Black History, the first chronicles of its people. In this book, there was a chapter by Marion Vella Smith, who for many, many, many years did research and talked about the Peterborough settlement and its people. She grew up in South Warren and went to school with Sidney Peters. And lastly was this Warren Cemeteries book. And the book on the left is what a normal copy should look like. The book on the right is mine. And when I say that this book has been a Bible to me, it's been absolutely invaluable, because back in 1985, Leland Overlock and family members and other community members went and canvassed every single cemetery. And actually, I was on the phone with his daughter on my way up here, and she was telling me about the heat and the bugs that were really a pain to deal with. But having a local resource such as this is absolutely wonderful. because there are stones in my cemeteries that are no longer there. They either were stolen or broken, or, who knows. I have used this book to start going through our cemeteries and figure out what stones are missing and then try to find out where they might be. This book has also been helpful because we've had 2 found stones within our community, one of which was buried in somebody's pasture. And a gentleman had dug it up and stood it up and was very proud of himself because he thought he found the burial spot of this one woman, and got a hold of me, and I couldn't find her record of her burial here in Warren. And in our books, there's also an index that Leland put together alphabetically, everybody who was buried from 1735 to 1985, and which cemetery, which row, and which lot. It's an absolute gem. And I couldn't find this woman in there either. Well, it turns out that that stone was stolen in the 70s by some kids jade rotting through that cemetery down in Newcastle area. And they had taken that stone, and somehow it ended up in Warren and was put over the burial of a horse. But that stone has been brought back to its rightful owners, the family cemetery. And we had another stone from Rockland that showed up in one of our cemeteries. Somebody, probably a kid that took it, and a parent just kind of dropped it off thinking, well, it belongs here. So this book has been absolutely valuable. So looking at your local resources, I would say are so, so important. And especially has been to this day when I'm doing research in any of my cemeteries. Historical and modern maps also has been a huge help. So I was able to go through different maps, some that the town has with records such as this book right here, records of the town of Warren. And this started with 1776. And this particular one went through 1824. They say the art of handwriting is dead. I encourage you to teach your grandchildren how to read cursive, because this is the only way. AI couldn't do it, is to reading through these books. Being able to read cursive was such a help. As for the maps, there were 2 maps that Emily Eaton did. One was in 1851 and another one that she did in 1876. And those maps showed details of everybody's streets and where everybody's houses were. In that area, it was a little skewed because of the topography, but it gave you a really good idea as to who was still in that area, who the head of the household was, etc. In fact, her hand-drawn maps were more accurate than others that the County of Lincoln had done in 1854. There's one hanging up at our Historical Society. It's one of those big, large wall maps. And if you look at the area for Peterborough, there's nothing there. So it boasts at the bottom, all of this was surveyed and da-da-da-da. Well, they didn't go in there to survey. I don't think they cared, is my take on it, because there were roads starting as 1790 that were going within that settlement, and documents that I have of all the different roads going in there that the town fathers had approved way back then. So other things that have helped in the search for information about Peterborough as a community were also aerial maps taken in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, historical topographical maps, and also, oddly enough, I stumbled one late night over the National Archives has had a list of post office reports of their different site locations. So way back when, if you wanted to have a post office, not only did you had to put in for it, but you had to draw a map. And this map would include all of your bodies of water, whether it was a creek, a river, the ocean, a lake, how close you were to the nearest railroad station, to the nearest town, and also to the other nearest, if any, post offices. And so in using this was helpful because the hand-drawn maps, I could also get information from, not only for Peterborough, but for some of my other cemeteries as well. What it came down to, though, for the meat and potatoes of my research really was using information from generous researchers who had gone before me so that I didn't have to try and reinvent the wheel. So I used information from Kate McMahon, Thomas Ziegler, Rick Davis, Karen Larson from our Warren Historical Society, who was very patient with me and still is to this day. And Marion Vella Smith, who since has passed, but again, she did some tremendous amount of research on the Peterborough community and its people. The websites that I used were varied depending on what I was looking for. And I can tell you when I first started off, I was pretty irritated at the fact with Ancestry that I would have to pay for the privilege of looking things up. And Karen Larson had an account. And so she was able to look some information up. But as I really got into things, I realized that if I wanted to look up military records, newspapers, other things that in a timely manner, and to have a wide scope of information, getting a membership on there and paying for that monthly membership really was going to be beneficial. So I did bite the bullet and do that. And it did open up a lot of doors and avenues that I could go down, and rabbit holes at 2 a.m. in the morning, I might add. But it really was very helpful. Other ones such as Find a Grave, Maine Genealogy, Family Search, newspapers.com, Digital Maine is a very good one from Maine that's free. Local newspaper archives, the Massachusetts Archives Collection, because remember until 1820 we were part of Massachusetts. Mapgeeks.org is a new one that was very helpful, and some of the archives. So because the history of Peterborough started way back when, you know, you're looking at the early 1780s when Amos and Sarah first were given this land. In fact, no one at this time has been able to put their hands on a copy of that actual documentation of that deed. We do have information later on when Amos has deeded land to his stepson, Paul Mink, and other, documents after that. But you really rely a lot on nibbles here, nibbles there, and trying to piece information together to get the whole story. But because it's a long time ago, even sometimes documentation that you have that's written documentation isn't necessarily the truth. It may be a partial part of the truth, maybe all, or may not be anything at all. Which comes to this slide of check and double check. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. The oral history is only as good as the memory of the information. If the story wasn't conveyed accurately the first time around, it's definitely going to affect the end results. And with my research, I realized that the spelling of names was not always consistently and accurately reflected, even on official documents and on people's headstones. And I've also seen this in some of our other ancient cemeteries. Stall Cemetery, which is on the other side of Stall Road, it used to be called Winkapaw. There was a bajillion different ways that you could spell Winkapaw. And so, trying to look up information, whether you are looking at ancestry.com or even on Find a Grave, may lead you down a different path that you didn't think was a correct one. So some of the examples of record accuracy challenges, I've got two. There are many others. One was with William Henry Peters. He's got the stone here, along with his wife. He was a private in the 14th Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, U.S. Colored Troops in the Civil War. And I did come across documentation that he was a deserter, which when I first saw it, I was like, oh, that can't be. Because one of the things we know growing up in small towns is that if somebody knows something, everybody's gonna know it. And so there wasn't any local oral history or records that I came across that suggested as such. And so I kept digging and I kept digging, and further research did prove that he was mixed up with another soldier in his unit who went by the name of William Peters, not William H. Peters, from Rhode Island. And in communication with Rick, who also researched Peters, he found that there were 3 men from New England named William Peters who served with the U.S. Colored Troops. And on top of that, Rick also discovered that through the National Park Civil War records, he found 4 named William H. Peters during the Civil War, and another 11 of William Peters that had no middle initial. So when you're doing the research, again, sometimes just coming across a name, William Peters, when your ancestor and all their mustering records and everything list is within a middle name or middle initial, it's important to keep, looking. The other example would be Francis Olney. So in doing his research on Francis, I first started at the cemetery, and this is his cleaned headstone right here. His last name is also documented as Oney, O-N-E-Y. Now, not everybody was literate back then. Sometimes, of course, people's spelling would be different. But this was my frustration and not knowing as to how to recognize him on the monument, because you definitely want to go by as much written documentation when you are doing, whether it's your own family tree or you're doing other research such as this, because it really reflects the accuracy of the name or place you're trying to research. However, here's my quandary. So he's listed as Olney, O-L-N-E-Y, on his mustering sheet, the Adjutant General's Report for the 52nd Sub-District of Warren. It's engraved on our Town of Warren Civil War monument as Olney. In the 1870 US Census, on his daughter's marriage record, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, Olney is noted as an alias on Francis's pension card for his widow, with Oney as the recognized spelling. And because of that, Oney is listed on his military headstone here and also on the receipt from the Vermont Marble Company. So while all the other documentation listed it as O-L-N-E-Y, when it came down to what was above his head as gravestone, it's Oney. So again, this is another thing when you're doing research from way back then. It's just important to try and chase every little tidbit down. They spelled it with an L. So not many times when you are doing research is it actually going to be carved into stone. And I can tell you that weighing on my shoulders made it a little difficult to finally commit to the final names of the soldiers for this monument, with checking and double checking. And even with that, there is space left on the bottom in case anybody needs to be added to it in the future if there's people that I've missed. But again, going through all of the records, I was going through who had started, for example, Amos Peters himself, who had started the community. Others like Daniel Lineo, who had moved to Peterborough and resided and lived the rest of their lives there. To others such as William Brackett, whose parents came there, and he moved away from Peterborough after being born there, but was also involved in the military. So the time came and the monument was carved and installed through the Brooks Monument Company, which is in Warren, and wonderful folks to work with. There were 3 gentlemen that helped install it. Bob Williams is the owner of Brooks Monument, who did the engraving and was very sort of patient with me when I'd say, wait, there's more. Carl Chipman and Ben Pratt were the 2 that assisted him in installing it one fall morning. This is Bob Williams right here. And I can tell you that coming down in the afternoon, because I didn't know it had been installed just yet, it was pretty awe-inspiring to see it. So the location of this monument is to the left of the flagpole when you come into the cemetery. And on the front is his epitaph. And on the back is listed all of our veterans' names. So the epitaph, if you can't read it in the back, it says, in memoram of veterans of the Peterborough community, we honor their service and their sacrifices to our country. This memorial is a testament to their lives, lest their names be forgotten. So these veterans represent participation in 6 different theaters of war, as well as those that did not serve during a time of war. They include the Revolutionary War, our Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I and II, and also the Korean War. I have 3 slides of veterans with their roll call, and I will just go through their names and read their names out as one would do with the roll call. Maynard Emery Beebe, William J. Brackley, Benjamin Franklin Carter, Daniel Lineo, Walter Francis Miles, Francis Olney, Abraham Peters, Amos Peters, Charles Edmund Peters, Daniel Webster Peters, Dexter Peters, Emerson Peters, James Peters, Merrill Peters, Reuben M. Peters, Samuel Stillman Peters, Sidney Carroll Peters, Webster Peters, William Francis Peters, and we had 2 William Henry Peters. We had William Henry Peters, who was a private in the 14th Rhode Island Heavy Artillery in the U.S. Colored Troops during the Civil War, as well as a William Henry Peters, who was a corporal in the 43rd Regiment of the U.S. Colored Troops in Infantry. Now, these names represent the 21 veterans that we did list on the monuments. However, in my research, there was a 22nd. His name was Albert Peters. He was the son of Benjamin and Nancy Howe Peters and a grandson of Amos and Sarah Peters. However, he lived a varied life and was imprisoned in prison. In 1862, he escaped from prison after being incarcerated for larceny and made his way to the encampment of the 20th of Maine. And Albert was able to enlist in Company A despite being a Black man. After only a few months, however, his identity was discovered, and he was taken back to prison where he resided until his death in 1865. Albert is buried in the grounds of the old Maine State Prison in Thomaston in an unmarked grave. So adding Albert's name to the list is certainly possible, as with any other veterans that I may have missed during my research, because there is space at the bottom of the stone. However, I had chosen to leave Albert's name off the list until a further discussion could be had with the descendants of the Peterborough community. I am a wife of a veteran myself, and not knowing back then what Albert's motive was to serve, whether he felt so moved to fight for his country and freedom, or whether he felt that because he had been in and out of prison a bit, that this was an easy ticket on the way out of Maine. And we just will never know. Yes?
One quick question. Of all those 3 pages, only one you've got asterisks that died in service. Does that mean all of them died after the wars?
No, actually and if I went too fast, we actually had another one that was killed, missing in action as well. And I apologize if I went too fast. So, yep, at the very bottom on the last slide. So there are ones that some of them were, in and out of the hospital a lot, became sick, died shortly afterwards, died after coming home. And we do know that documented, there are the names right there on the stone. We do know that for the documented veterans that are buried in Peterborough, include Benjamin Franklin Carter, Daniel Lineo. Again, he's in an unmarked grave, but we do have the death card for that. And both of his daughters are buried in unmarked graves within Peterborough as well. Francis Olney, Abraham or Abram Peters. Again, that was a different spelling. When I first started off, I was told that there was indeed a separate Abraham and Abram Peters that had served. And doing research, I found they were one and the same person. Charles Edmund Peters, Samuel Stillman Peters, Sidney Carroll Peters, William Francis Peters, and William Henry Peters. Also buried in Peterborough is Patrick Michael Carter, who served in the U.S. Army. Patrick was born in Camden well after the community of Peterborough shut down in the 50s. And so His name is not on the honor roll of veterans because he was not born in, nor did he reside in Peterborough, because at that time in our history, Peterborough had been gone. So this is a picture that was taken by my son, Chris, the morning of our ceremony honoring our veterans. And boy, with Maine weather, we really lucked out. It was I tell you, the ground was not squishy, the bugs were not bad, and the sun was out. So this is, although you can't see the stones very well, but this is a picture of our cemetery during the time of the dedication, and we had probably over 70 people that attended. The really neat part about this is that we had put information out in the papers, and I had spoken to some of the descendants from the Peters family that were local. And through Kate McMahon, I was also able to chat with Thomas Ziegler, who is also kind of a family historian of his own, with a lot of information about his ancestry and how it came from the humble beginnings of the Peterborough community. So he came up from Texas, his mother came from Florida, and he had cousins that came up from Boston because his branch of the family had moved to Boston from Peterborough. Once they got there, though, the local Peters descendants didn't know the out-of-state Peters descendants. And I can truly say that one of the best parts of that day was actually witnessing these folks realize that they were related, they had a commonality, and that they had family that they didn't know about before. And that was, I think, truly that other than just being able to come together as a community to honor these veterans, I think that was the best part of my day. Here's a picture that I took at the General Knox Museum. And these are not all of the ones that were there, but the ones that came to the museum. These are the descendants that came both local and from out of state. The museum was so generous in allowing us they hosted a reception for us there, and were giving tours and connecting with people that wanted to learn a little bit more about Henry Knox. It was a lot of fun. It was a great day. And I understand that now these family members have forged, relationships and are looking forward to meeting up again together this upcoming summer here in Mid-Coast, Maine. So this picture right here is of John Mine himself. And John was recognized by the town of Warren at our Veterans Appreciation Supper, which started back up again after COVID. And he's was given a plaque, and that was presented by Sherry Howard, who is our town manager here on the left. And on the right, Jan McDonald, who was the chair at that time, and was also a Board of Selectmen member for the town of Warren. So she was serving dinner that night, yes. So this is a supper that the Historical Society sponsors every year, and they did not have it, of course, during COVID, but they have scouts that help with serving the meals and serving the veterans and everything. So it's a great way to bring the community together. John was recognized by the town of Warren for his dedication in honoring the sacrifice and service of our veterans from the Peterborough community. And his passion and dedication in elevating and recognizing a long forgotten community and its veterans is a gift that I really feel is not only to the descendants of Peterborough and our town of Warren, but to Maine as a whole as well. There were many people that live in Warren that when they found out about what I'd been up to with the research and the fact that we were going to be having this monument dedication, that this was the first time they'd heard that we had a large Black community living within our borders. And I greatly appreciate John's dedication and determination to make a difference and to try and recognize those that he felt had fallen from the roles of history. Sidney Peters who was a Army veteran who served over in Korea, was our last cemetery caretaker and one of the last from the families who lived in Peterborough to move out. Once Sidney had passed away in 91, two of his daughters, Sidney Peters Robinson, and Rosie Rivera, were ones that took over keeping up the duties of mowing the cemetery and trying to keep it tidy and removing branches for several years until they asked the town of Warren to step in. Since that time period, the cemetery itself was given to the town by the Hart family, and then the land in between the cemetery and Bunker Hill Road was given to the town by Mr. Joel Gray. So we are very fortunate in the fact that our community members also feel the need to help preserve the cemetery because this truly is really the only substantial thing that we have left remaining from a community that lasted from 1783 to the 1950s. So the future cemetery goals that we have is to continue researching these cemetery burials using online and also with local funeral home resources. Working with the family descendants to determine how best to recognize these unmarked interments within the cemetery. There is, as I'm sure you all know of, a website called Find a Grave. And on that for the Peterborough Cemetery, many of the graves, of course, are on there. People have added people that they are assumed that are buried there, but that we don't actually have any written documentation for. They're including is Amos Peters, who the photo for Amos Peters is not Amos Peters. So the hope is to try and update, not necessarily right away with Find a Grave, but to have something that is on site that recognizes everybody that we're aware of who's buried there, as well as on our own Town of Warren Cemetery link, so that the goal is to get everybody's names up there. And also, I've been researching the deeds of the original 150 acres of land. And quite recently, I came across a brand new deed. And this mentions Reuben Mink deeding the cemetery in November of 1860 to 3 trustees of the South Warren Burying Ground. However, from this point forward, and while I've not done every single descendant from him, I've just started now on his sister to see if that's where the trail went. But not anywhere is there any other documentation of these 3 trustees, which were Daniel Peters, William Peters, they were brothers and also cousins of Reuben, and A.L. Pierce, who married into the family and had a daughter that married in as well. So there's no records right now of the incorporation of these trustees with the South Warren Burying Ground. However, it does answer some questions that I've always had looking at old death records and those death cards that you see online, in which the undertaker had listed as to place of burial as the South Warren Cemetery or the South Warren Burial Ground. I always thought that they confused it with the Count Cemetery, which historically has been the South Warren Cemetery. But finding this particular deed opened up another avenue of information I didn't know existed till a couple of weeks ago. Doing this deed research and on-the-ground investigation is also helpful because last year it was reported that by a family member who had seen the graves himself, but could not, we did go up and look, but couldn't find them, is that there's another reported 4 grave sites, 4 unmarked, not with headstones, but ringed with stones, graves that are on original land from the Peters family. And so trying to find where those graves might be is also something that I'm working on. My other hope is to acquire someone to come in to do some ground penetrating radar of both the cemetery and the land between the Western Cemetery fence and the Bunker Hill Road to help determine these locations of unmarked graves and appropriately mark them. And the way that this ground penetrating radar works is that it detects anomalies in the structure of the ground underneath you. So that if there's been some disturbance, if there's been a casket or something different than the normal layers of soil layers there, that it can alert you to that. So the reason for doing that is that we'd like to be able to make sure that all of those locations within the cemetery are identified so that there is nothing planted, whether it is a new headstone, a new gravesite, or a tree in memorandum that is put inadvertently on somebody else's grave, as well as to see if it's possible to identify any of the reported graves underneath these big white pines. And of course, the long-term goal is to get the cemetery listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And that's something that's going to take some time, but it's definitely a long-term goal. So this is the entrance to Peterborough Cemetery in the fall, shortly after the monument was placed and we had our ceremony. You can see the gray of the big memorial stone in the back. In the forefront are 3 of those beautiful big eastern white pines that oral history has people being buried underneath. And it's the new Peterborough Cemetery sign to try and brighten up the cemetery. Work is still being done. Even this spring I was in before hopefully the ticks could get me, and the poison ivy, I might add, of cleaning up the brush that's underneath the trees on both sides of the avenue. And with the goal of getting all of that removed here this spring and to bring in, again, hopefully someone this summer to do some ground radar work for us. So I'd like to end my talk today in closing by reading the epitaph of Sarah E. Peters. Now remember, her stone is the oldest one that's in the cemetery, but more than likely because of people dying through the years prior to that and being buried in unmarked graves, much less if there were stones prior that might have disappeared. We do have, during this past last fall, we were able to uncover a couple other monument foundations that had been buried by sand and duff through the years, and there were broken off headstones, evidence still in those footings. So there were stones that were in some of these places that had disappeared. I also was able to go through with my metal detector and find a couple unmarked graves that had the temporary markers that were buried. No lettering remained on them, but we were able to bring them up to surface and mark them so that if we can collaborate with some of our local funeral home records, we might be able to put a name to that spot. So I'd like to go ahead and read the epitaph, which is very faint, but now legible that the stones have been cleaned. Gone from the hearts that love her, gone from her home away, gone in her childish beauty to the realms of endless day. So as for the community of Peterborough, may it be gone, but not forgotten. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? I saw your hand, Dana. I'm gonna bring the mic around to you.
What did they do? Were they farmers, or was it industry, or was it a setup as a little township? Is it okay if I answer? I know that you've got the mic. Is it okay if I answer this one? Sure, you bet. So the question was exactly what did the members of this community do for work? And so members of this community were varied. You had folks that worked in the woolen mill, a lot of mariners. You had a lot of farmers. This land back in the 1880s, it was part of the Waldo Purchase. Stalls Hill in particular, which is adjoining this land, was heavily timbered. In fact, there's history of the mariners out at sea, that if they could see the tall eastern white pine on the top of Stalls Hill, that would help guide them into Thomaston Harbor by finding the mouth of the St. George. Only a few trees remain up there to this day. It's a beautiful blueberry field up there now, But the trees have encroached on a lot of the areas that would have been open in the past. And there's evidence of a lot of farming that went down in there, especially by the back river. That was an area that they hayed, and then they would use that hay to cover strawberries because they would sell strawberries. There was people that would work as hotelers in town, worked, I'm imagining, for even Knox's estate once he and his wife moved back up from New York City. They worked in a variety of jobs, and while there were no records of actual stores within the community, they were very industrious. They were also very well off in the sense that they did not have to pay a mortgage when the Peters family first settled there. These were lands that were owned by them. So they were able to put their resources into themselves and their children and their day-to-day. Certainly.
So to the best of your knowledge, is everyone who's buried in the Peterborough Cemetery a descendant of Amos Peters?
So is everyone buried there a descendant thereof? No. But there are people who moved to Peterborough once Peterborough was a Black community. So for the example of Daniel Linneo, who moved up here from Louisiana after the Civil War, and he married and settled in Peterborough. He died and was buried there, as well as, so far, I found records of 2 of his daughters being buried there. There are some of the family names that you see going into this cemetery, as well as when you're doing research, will be only Peters, Carter. There's also Mink, and I think those are the ones right now that stand out to me. So not everybody was a direct descendant, but the Peterborough area did grow from other free Blacks moving into the area once it became a community known for being a Black community.
So that prompts my second question. I think I remember you said you had to be a Peters descendant to be buried there in the future. And if that's true, why?
Well, in particular, because all of my cemeteries that I take care of are hallowed ground. This one in particular, because this was from a community of people who I feel is important to preserve the fact that prior to me coming, it was family members and descendants and those that had moved there. I cannot in good faith just sell lots in a historical cemetery in which this represented a community who is no longer there, that's no longer there. And so at this time, the only folks that will be allowed to be buried there are people who are descended or related to those that first, came from the Peterborough community, to honor that memory and to honor the community itself.
Could you tell me again why General Knox gave land to Amos Peters? And then I do have another question after that.
Sure. I can't really directly answer that because there's a lot of different stories that are out there, reported stories as to how the 2 of them met. More than likely it was during the Civil War. Amos was a cook, and not Civil War, Revolutionary War, my apologies, during the Revolutionary War. And more than likely, Amos came across Knox during that time period. As to where and when, I do not know. But it was said that what Knox had told him, that if you come to Maine, I will give you land and you can, start your life after the war up there. I have been in conversation with folks in regards to the actual location of Peterborough. It was close to Thomaston. It was close to, of course, Knox's other lands. This was part of the Waldo patent. And so it It was lands that both Lucy, his wife, and Knox were in charge of, that they had control over. And what always has been interesting to me is that by doing the research of the town of Warren, the earliest settlers there were given lands that started from the river going out. So your land, of course, back then, the real highways were the waterways. And so the land that was given to settlers was 10 rods wide by however many rods it took to reach 100 acres. Now, Amos Peters, a Black man not from Maine, was granted 150 acres. Now, while that land may not have been primed for logging, because I do believe at this time that the majority of the trees had already been taken during the Waldo Purchase for all the shipbuilding and the firewood needed for various and sundry things, as why to the location and the amount of land that he got from Knox, we just don't know. There is no deed that has been discovered that gives more information on that as to exactly when. But it was believed in the early 1780s is when he settled in that area.
My second question is, do you do this amount of research for each of the 18 cemeteries?
Yeah. So I do a tremendous amount. I have spent hundreds of hours researching Peterborough. But we also have in our town, because a lot of our cemeteries are ancient burial grounds, we don't have burial maps. We don't have records. And so when you're trying to figure out who's buried in a cemetery, sometimes it helps by knowing who's not. So for example, the Stall Cemetery, which is on the other side of Stall Hill, has a lot of people buried there that were from the Stall Hill area and the western side of town, and trying to figure out, because we do have some unmarked graves in there, trying to figure out who might be buried there, because back then you were buried with your family. I mean, people were brought back after the war. People were brought back if you died in Boston or elsewhere. If they could, your body was reparated and brought back to your hometown and buried in your family plot. It's helpful finding out who's not buried there, so you can therefore determine more so of who might be buried there. So I have not got into as much detail with my other cemeteries. I have 18. But the goal is to update the information in the cemetery book at some point, because of course, since 1985, there's been a lot of burials. We do have in some of our cemeteries, because those records were not kept, there's a lot of what looks like empty lots available. And so I have had community members saying, I'd like to be buried at Sterling or Skinner Cemetery or at the older section of Pleasantville. And I don't have answers for them if those are truly bare plots at this time. So for me, it's important to get as much information I can about each cemetery, not only to make sure that the folks that are there are recognized and so those lots aren't used, but again, it's a part of history, and because not all cemeteries have equal amount of recorded history, I want to be able to try and do that. Sir, did you have a comment to add to that?
I have a comment.
Okay.
Would the local funeral homes have provided services to that community?
Yes. So, back in the day, many times, whether it was a wedding or a funeral, if someone passed away within the community, the wake would be held at the schoolhouse, or before the building of the schoolhouse in 1845, it would be held in somebody's home. And then the burial would be done by themselves, at the cemetery, but the death recorded with the town clerk. So as more modern times came along, I've been able to read notes from Sawyer, who was one of our undertakers in town. And I was able to read his notes and confirm there were several of his burials that didn't have headstones that he buried, and he would list the time of day and if he had to purchase shoes or any other type of clothing or anything else for the funeral, what the family would be charged there for. We do have death cards from other undertakers in Rockland and in Thomaston as well. And so my hope is, I have spoken to a couple of the funeral home directors to see if I can look up during certain years or using those last names of the common family last names that were part of the Peterborough community, if I can again track down those that I've not been able to find online as to who might be buried there. In all my spare time.
So just to comment on why that piece of land. If you're familiar with that piece of land, after they cut that, there was nothing there. That terrible farmland, I've been all through that. It's a huge, huge tract of land in the middle of nowhere.
It is.
That's, so yes, why would it be, yeah, take this, it's worthless.
You know what, and that's a conversation that I've had with someone recently, an archaeologist, when talking about some of the cellar holes that still remain in that area. And why would Knox be seen as a benevolent, $5 word of the day, benevolent, you know, gentleman, and giving away all this land to, you know, a poor Black man. And what it really came down to is that the land was probably stripped. But it was close enough to Thomaston and possibly to meet some of his needs in the future. We just, again, don't know. But the land, there was not really much value. There wasn't, although the back river came up that way, it was nothing that you could build ships on or, you know, really navigate with a large boat. So it was a lot of land, but it was a lot of nothing in that same sense.
Probably Lucy lost, she might have lost that land in a card game because she lost a lot of time. She loved to play cards.
She did. And so when originally doing the research for this and looking at the old maps of Warren, for example, the ones that Eaton had done back in the day, is that there are rock walls that didn't match up with anything. And beating feet and looking, and I actually was in there the other day, hiking around and taking a look at some of the rock walls and everything and trying to make sense of, you know, why were these things there? These rock walls were even in place way back then. And so that led to looking into the Waldo patent and realizing that this was part of the Waldo patent back there. Now, whether the other issue was somebody living on that land when Knox gave it to Peters, because we do know that Henry Knox was not very kind to those that he considered were squatting on his land. And he did end up kicking off people that were born and raised on land up here when he and Lucy moved up here and he became in control of all the land. So, you know, it also is a wonder, was there anybody remaining on that land or not? So, yes.
Well, the pandemic was awful. I'm very thankful to the pandemic for the gentleman who saw the discrepancies and the injustices, and to you to being able to do research to bring together this beautiful program. For someone that's been coming to Maine since I was born and only recently learning about a town called Peterborough that I never knew even existed, that we drove through on Route 90, you know, coming or going somewhere. This is really interesting. So thank you very much. My question is, doing a lot of cemetery exploring, starting myself, did you at all utilize dowsing? Did you at all utilize drone to be able to find some of these hidden, lost places that you are still looking for?
So dowsing in the sense of as if you were dowsing for water, I have not done that particular. A lot of it has been just looking at the lay of the land, and then what I have called dowsing, or using a rod to probe down and seeing what I'm finding. That's what I've done. And so I've not been able to connect with somebody to use a drone as of yet. The aerial maps that I mentioned, 40s, 50s, and 60s, were helpful in a sense in realizing that some of my cemeteries, Peterborough included, by the way, if you have a chance to go to Peterborough, you'll realize that there is a chain link fence that was put up, but also put up on the interior of what the rock wall was. And so there's a couple feet on one side that it's on this side of the rock wall, as well as over by the gay residence. I don't know how far over the original cemetery went. And so speaking with Sydney and some other people who seem to remember other grave sites that went back down towards the water, I've wondered about that myself. I've done a lot of going to, as I said, going to the cemetery in the early morning hours to see if I can see any dips. Back in 2006, when the remainder part of the cemetery was donated to the land or to the town, a lot of tree cutting was done and the chain link fence was put up. And during that time, the town manager had approved to have the ground leveled and the graves filled in. So this is it's unfortunate for if you're looking at the historical sense of those graves that were then kind of sunken down and you knew where they were covered. Since then, it's been some time. Those graves have still kind of continued to sink a little bit and things settle so that you can see them. For those that were doing the mowing and felt that they were not safe in mowing around them, or that they had to get off their mower in order to mow, or use a weed whacker. It's, again, it's what I feel is, it's an ancient cemetery. It's a historical cemetery. And I do feel that it's an unfortunate that the graves were filled in, but that at that time, things were done to try and preserve it. And so sometimes even the best intentions down the road, you realize were not the best long-term, for an area, whether you're trying to restore something, rebuild something, recognize something. Hindsight can be 20/20, in that sense. You're welcome.
One question? Question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, folks.